Hi, my name is Atia Perkins, and I will be recapping training on understanding diversity for educators. And this falls under Purposeful Words of Perks. I'd like to start off with reminding everyone that diversity means contrast. And I'd like for you to embrace it because contrast means strikingly different. And so for today, my goal is to add value by motivating you to embrace what is being shared and also to understand our differences. Here is the definition of diversity. It is also a set of conscious practices that involves understanding and appreciating interdependence of humanity, cultures, and of the natural environment. Practicing mutual respect for qualities and experiences that are different from our own. Understanding that diversity includes not only ways of being, but also ways of knowing. Recognizing that cultural, personal, and institutionalized discrimination creates a sustained privilege for some while creating a sustained disadvantage for others. And finally, building alliances across differences so that we can work together to eradicate all forms of discrimination. Perks pointer number 1, Stephen Covey states, a person must seek to understand before being understood. And now is the time to take advantage of students' heightened interest and engagement of understanding racism and social justice, as well as injustice. Knox Schools grows young adults who are well-rounded, global, and critical thinkers by building awareness that ultimately supports change. This is part of your role. Knox students need a champion educator who are willing to examine themselves, their behaviors, and their values as part of improvement efforts by becoming cultural competent educators. And finally, we can't celebrate diversity, we must normalize it. Here I shared that I read Cultural Competence Now by Mayfield, and the definition of cultural competence is written as follows: the ability to use critical thinking skills to interpret how cultural values and beliefs influence conscious and unconscious behavior, understanding of how inequity can be and has been perpetuated through socialized behaviors, and the knowledge and determined disposition to disrupt inequitable practices to achieve greater personal and professional success for yourself and others. Now is the time that we are growing and becoming more cultural competent. In this next slide, we focus on what does it mean when you use the word blame. And thank you for some of the feedback shared was that blame can come from a place of embarrassment due to family upbringing and belief, or more importantly, blame will allow some to point the finger at someone else because you don't want to point the finger at yourself. And why is that? Is because we live in a society where race, culture, diversity isn't spoken about. But for today and proceeding forward, I want to continue to encourage you that you have the power to implement systems of safeguards for students to be able to talk and learn about cultural competence. Showing empathy in a complex, changing world means creating an environment where students are comfortable with having uncomfortable discussions. You will need to get ready to the new norm of having crucial conversations, what I'd like to call the double C. Also, authentic leadership is showing vulnerability by being able to reflect on the opinion of others as well as yourself and what you may have started with a thought and how it may have shifted or what you believe in, and being able to share that with those around you. You have to always keep in mind that knowing it's your job to help students navigate social situations and to dismantle the systems that make it difficult for students to understand why it is important to show love and respect towards one another. It is part of the Knox mission statement, always toward the light. So it's a core value, it's your history, and you also can't negate the fact that you have more than 60% of your student population is of the Asian and Caucasian descent. So you must be able to check in with them as well. And finally, you must be able to get in tune with yourself and recognize as well as dismantle your own unconscious biases because they do affect your perception of those you interact with. That's right, your students. And your staff needs to understand too that when you dismantle these falsehoods, or at least notice they exist, and that's the key word, to notice that they exist, then we are on a path to undoing them and, more importantly, dismantling those stereotypes. This is an example of what seems to be a rise in polarizing public language that meets the dictionary definition of racist. Having or showing the belief that a particular race is superior to another. It is also an example of explicit conscious prejudice when someone outwardly expresses through words or behaviors a view degenerating a particular group. Unconscious biases, also known as implicit biases, are the underlying attitudes and stereotypes that people unconsciously attribute to another person or group of people that affect how they understand and engage with a person or a group. Research shows our brain adjusts to quickly process information that is deemed as socially relevant. It may be within our power to redefine what is socially relevant to conceptualize brain function for our understanding of prejudice and how we can use it to limit our own biases. In the book White Fragility, written by Dr. Robin DiAngelo, she states that historically reinforced ideologies such as individualism and colorblindness have left many white people racially illiterate, but racially conscious when it is perceiving other racial groups. So because they're in the dominant culture, they don't necessarily have to think about race, but they'll maybe notice racial issues that are not related to whiteness. If you see something, say something. There is an identity test that's called the implicit association test. It was originated by William Cross, and now psychologist Janet Helms, in her theoretical framework, she calls it the white racial identity development model. And it's for people who identify as white or identify as people of color. And on the lowest level of the scale, is when you are denying racism or internalizing negative narratives. When you move up the higher level on this scale, stages 5 or 6, is when you relinquish the privileges of racism or you advocate on behalf of oppressed people. I highly encourage that you look into this framework and use it as a reflection piece. And if you've ever been called a racist, I highly encourage you to seek to understand the why by asking, why do you think that? And that can begin to have those conversations about racism and understanding each other. So there are 3 types of racism. Institutionalized racism is the first one, and that is the one that creates the structural barriers in our world. The second form of racism is person mediated, and this is the most common form of racism and the one that people think of when they think of racism. This form of racism is what maintains structural barriers because it involves acts of prejudice and discrimination. And the third form of racism is internalized, and this is extremely important. This is when the stigmatized race believes what society has assumed about them, and they act according to the stigma around them. So when I talked and shared the story about the teddy bear in the back seat of the car, while it is used to help a perception of being pulled over if you are a person of color, but it is also what do you do with that information. And I highly encourage anyone, as you're teaching children, they should not internalize any form of discrimination that is just the way it is, or that race is better than this race, or any type of foolishness wrapped around the idea that color has to determine your self-value, because it doesn't. Continue to acknowledge the facts that Knox welcomes students from all over the world, 17 different countries, and it is your job to continue to check the pulse of all of your students. Staff and administration are not reflective of the student body, but it's not the way you look, it's what you are pushing out to the students and seeking to understand from them. Keep in mind that Black educators are not okay, as burdens are falling on them disproportionately, and it won't be shown or discussed. In today's world, Black people have been triggered, and we are just not okay, and neither should you. So here is a clip from our training, and I want to remind you all what it means to feed into our students of today.
What purpose do you bring to the lives that you interact with? And as educators, I believe that's one of the most phenomenal roles to have. And a lot of times we continuously say that they're the future leaders of tomorrow for the students that we educate. But for me, I believe they're the future leaders of today. Look at what they're presenting, what they're asking, what they're doing, what's out there. And it's challenging us to be able to think a little differently, to be able to provide a place of understanding and acceptance.
So here are some sample questions that you can use to anticipate, assess, and prevent potential adverse consequences of proposed actions that will take place at Knox on different racial groups. So I will keep this slide up for a few minutes so you can go through all of these, and I will send further documentation to you to go deeper with these. And so before I close out, I just want to remind you all that we are change agents. You're a change agent, and you are here for one purpose, and that is to add value to the lives of those that you interact with, and more importantly, understand the value that you have within yourself. So thank you, change agents. Thank you for taking this journey to understand diversity, and we will continue to go deeper to help one another.